Blah. Oh, welcome back to the second segment of our John Christ in-depth career-spanning interview. It's just like what we did with Eerie Von. Once again, my co-host, Ace Von Johnson's the guest co-host, and boy, does he reveal the aces that are up his sleeve in this segment of the interview. This is what I was talking about the last interview. This is where Ace comes in guns a-blazing and just asks all the right questions and gives some great track for John Christ to lay his locomotive down on and just zip, zap, zoom. I never would have been able to get out of him. I talked about that in the previous episode and whatnot. And so we continue the conversation. We go back in time, and it's amazing to hear John Christ. I mean, he flows so succinctly. I know this is not his first interview. He's done a bunch of these things. It's kind of amazing to think that he had kind of been out of the spotlight for a while, because it feels like he does interviews like that. He's been doing interviews for like the last, I don't know, like 20 years, like nonstop, like every day nonstop, the way he talks. He just goes into it, and it's hard to get a word in only because I don't want to interrupt the most beautiful flow. He's just talking so succinctly and just crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's. And, the real takeaway I feel from this segment of the interview is that John really goes into how integral he was to the Danzig sound. Okay. We know Glenn Danzig wrote these songs or came up with these song ideas. I feel like John Christ has never really gotten the credit that is due to him for just all of the, everything that he brought to the table. I mean, we talk about Chuck Biscuits too, and it's amazing how, like, now after speaking to John Christ so succinctly, all the members of that first version of the Danzig band, John Christ will let John Christ explain John Christ, part in things. But just the fact that Chuck Biscuits, the way Chuck Biscuits plays and hits the drums, drives John Christ's guitar playing. And then you have Eerie Von. I remember in Eerie's interview when he talked about, his role, and Eerie was always very, very self-disparaging about his abilities to a certain extent, a little bit, if you listen to the thing. But what became abundantly clear when speaking to him was that his piece was that he was like the solvent. He was the glue of the band. It was Eerie who glued those pieces together. He was the one that made all the chemistry work. So you have John Christ and Chuck Biscuits being able to do what they can do because of Eerie, and then Eerie's connection with Glenn, and all of it, swirls together in the right kind of way through the prism of Rick Rubin and gives us all of this incredible music, but I'm not going to be able to do it justice. So let's listen to John Christ talk about it himself. And this is the part of the intro where I talk again about the Patreon. That's right. Patreon makes the world go round. You don't want to miss out. That's where you're going to see early premieres of all of this stuff. The Patreons and the YouTube members, they get to see it way before you get to see it, as well as secret shows, outtakes. There's an archive, a rich archive full of material that is not available on the YouTube channel publicly. So, even if you don't want to stick around, come inside, stay as long as you like, check out some cool stuff, and bounce whenever you feel you need to bounce. I'm not the only one with a Patreon. Ace Von Johnson, he also has a Patreon. Make sure you check out Ace's Patreon. Go follow Ace on his Instagram and his Twitter. He's got a link tree. The link will be in the description. And John Christ as well. John Christ has a johnchrist.com, and you can find him on Instagram, and you can find him on Twitter. You can find him. I think he said he was developing a YouTube channel as well. So John Christ, he's getting out there. He's putting himself out there now, doing stuff. So make sure you keep your eyes peeled. And he might be coming to a town near you when he's out there doing shows. He was doing shows. He's John Christ's Snakes of Christ. How about that? So without further ado, let's dive in and watch the episode, shall we? Hey guys, what's going on? It's Jeff. So I've decided to make a Patreon. What is Patreon? I don't know how to define a Patreon. Let me look it up. Patreon is a membership platform that makes it very easy for creators to get paid for the things that they're already creating. I want to do it full time. I want this to be my full-time job. In my efforts to make that happen, I've set up this platform. Is it going to work? Is it going to be successful? I don't know, but I would rather try and crash and burn than not try at all. The goal is to create enough passive revenue so that I can continue to do this full-time, uninterrupted. Why? Because I love to do this. I love creating content. I love making videos. I love shooting films. I love doing podcasts. In case you couldn't tell, I love to talk and I never shut the fuck up. So right now I've kept the Patreon incredibly simple. There's 2 tiers, and that may change in the future. The Murdergram is a simple way to extend support for all of the hours and hours of free content on the channel for nothing more than $1. 38 cents goes to Patreon. What's $1.38, eh? It's less than a cup of coffee, but it's a great way that you can show support for very little effort. When you divide that $1.38 by the hours and hours and hours of time spent listening to this endless drivel of content, the dollar cost average works out. Next up is the YouTube casualty for $6.66. The YouTube casualty is loaded to the gills. Enjoy the archive ad-free, as well as ad-free early access to special docu-style podcast videos, music reaction commentaries, and the like, a month before they drop on YouTube, loaded with ads, I might add. You're also going to get exclusive content and behind-the-scenes content that is not available on YouTube or anywhere else. So you get to peek behind the veil. And believe me, there's a couple of choice pieces. Most of all, more than anything, whether you join the Patreon or not, I just want to thank each and every one of you that comes to the channel, that watches all the shows, that leaves comments, that participates, that subscribes. That's really the most important thing. This is just trying to find a way to earn a living as an artist. And with that, thank you for my TED Talk. Join the Patreon because we need you! 66 cents. Oh, that was the perfect musical interlude. We've never had that element on the podcast. That's perfect. So now we're going back. You briefly mentioned, your background, your dad was into music as well. And, you grew up, you've studied music. You are a studied musician. What was your opinion or viewpoint of punk rock as it was coming up, coming from your background?
So that's a great question. And if you've done research on me, you know what my old answers were. And it's funny because I really, looking back, I didn't have a clue about what punk rock was growing up in a little town just outside of Baltimore. There was a big punk rock scene in Baltimore I knew nothing about. There's a place downtown called the Marble Bar, right? Where they had fights nightly, and there were punk rock bands. And they did the same thing in Baltimore they did in Jersey and New York and all that, where they would rent out VFW halls on the weekends and sell tickets for beer and have shows and all. I was oblivious to that. I was plugged into heavy metal. I was plugged into rock and roll. I had a bunch of older sisters. They were into the mellow Beatles, America, Barry Manilow, all that kind of stuff. But their boyfriends were, they were like Aerosmith, They're like, listen to this, John. I was like, man, what the hell is that? That's not the Beatles. And they're like, oh, so they would bring over all their records, right? So they were bringing over Black Sabbath. They were bringing over Kansas. They were bringing over Eric Clapton, Jimi Hendrix. First Van Halen album I ever heard was one of my sister's boyfriend's album, and that was the first band I was ever in. I auditioned for his band when I was 15 and got in. My sister's boyfriend, Joe Matthews, who's a rhythm guitar player, never studied music, didn't read music, any of that. But he could play bar chords and he could write songs on the back of a napkin that would make you cry, right? So he had it, just it was raw. And I wasn't exposed to any of the punk rock stuff until I got into junior, senior high. And then you started seeing the flannel shirts and the Doc Martens and all that. But I was like the heavy metal, jazz rock side and punk rock. So we would throw food at each other from across the cafeteria at school. We didn't like each other. I didn't know anything about the Misfits. I didn't know anything about the Stooges, the New York Dolls, none of that. All that education came after I joined Samhain, right? So my thing was like, I don't like punk rockers. They wear eye makeup. They're weird. They got yellow and green hair. Let's kick their ass. That's where I came from. But now, as a teacher and teaching history of rock and roll, I'm familiar with all that stuff. And Eerie Von and Chuck Biscuits were my teachers when I joined Sam Hain, because Eerie was like, well, all right, now you're in the group. We haven't done a record yet, so you got to learn all these Sam Hain songs and 120 Misfit songs. And I was like, okay. And I was hanging out with Eerie, and we worked out at the gym every day. And he started telling me about the Bad Brains and Bauhaus and all these other, bands and everything that were going on. And Chuck was from the LA scene, so they were schooling me on all that. So I got a new respect for it later, which is part of the beauty of music, because just like the Beatles, um, when the electric guitar came out, um, and the amplifiers started getting, after World War II, affordable enough so that one guy could work and feed his whole family and get a piano and a guitar and a car that never existed before the end of World War II, right? So booming economies changed the way rock and roll and everything happened. So it created this mass market, and because of guys like Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley, um, you didn't have to be that good to make great music. You didn't have to be a great musician to write great songs. And when now we had this baby boomer generation that came of age in the 60s, and when they picked up on that, man, it was on. It was on. So I have a complete new respect for that. And I was fortunate enough that because I grew up in a Catholic family, we all had to take piano lessons from the nuns and all that kind of stuff. I learned to read music early on. And that was why am I telling you that? Because by the time I met Rick Rubin and Glenn Danzig in '87, um, I was studying jazz with the guy who wrote the song Whiplash, right? Hank Levy, who played sax in Stan Kenton's. That was an accident. That wasn't my plan. I went to school because I didn't want to get a job. And I said, if I could go to music school and then I can at least teach music, I'll do that while I'm writing my great Led Zeppelin rock songs, and I'm going to move to LA when I grow up. So it was just like a stopgap plan that my parents agreed to, or at least he's going to college, at least he's getting good grades, blah, 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 blah. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, no, I'm not going to be a jazz musician. I'm going to be a rock and roll star somewhere. I just don't know where. I don't know how it's going to happen, but I'm just going to keep working on it. And I got into jazz school playing jazz bass because they already had 50 guitar players. The program was closed. They didn't have enough bass players. I was like, I'll play bass. So I borrowed a bass guitar. I've been borrowing instruments my whole life because I didn't have any money to buy them. So I knew a guy that had a bass from high school. Hey, can I borrow it? And he's like, yeah. So I went and auditioned. I got in. And then I started studying jazz. And I was like, okay, this will help. And then by the time I met, Rick and Glenn, man, I was a jazz snob.
Well, wait, question. So you well, first of all, how did you hear about Samhain? Did you know about Rick Rubin before Samhain, or were you familiar with Rick Rubin at that time? He wasn't Rick Rubin then. He was still, he was just a guy who had a label and was doing stuff.
Yep.
Um,
So, I had not. So the connection, and it's out there. I'll keep it brief. But yeah, I was going to a place Towson State. Now it's Towson.
oh right,
Eh,
London May. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
right. So London May was Sam Hain's drummer. His parents were architects, and a buddy of mine, Timmy Moore, that I went to high school with, worked at the firm. And he and I used to play Little League Baseball together. That's how far we go back to our nine
Wow.
years old or whatever. And it was just one of those things where he would go into the office and they had pictures of their son, and they had like November Coming Fire on the wall, and I think they had Initium, and London was in the pictures of the blood shows where they put the sheep's or goat's blood or whatever it was, and they had those all over their office walls. And my buddy Timmy was like, "What's that about?" And they said, "Oh, my son plays drums," and I didn't know anything about that until much later when he came to me and said, "Yeah, my boss's son's band needs a guitar player to get a record deal. Are you interested?" And I said, "No." Right?
Yeah.
Only because he said it's punk rock music. If he'd said it was heavy metal or, you know, hair metal or anything like that, or even, top 40, I might have said, "Really?" But he was like punk, and I was like, "Nah, I don't want to do punk. I'm overwhelmed with just trying to keep up with the people that have been playing jazz since they were 5 years old. I'm playing catch up in the program over here because I challenged my way into the school. So I could play, but I didn't have all the requisite classes and all. So I was like, "Nah, man, I'm buried. I can't do it." 6 months later, came back again. "Hey, they still don't have a guitar player." And I was like, "Yeah." And they said, "Yeah." And they have a producer interested, but he said they got to hire a new guitar player. And I said, "Well, what record label?" And they said CBS. I said, "CBS?" He goes, "Yeah, out of New York." And I said, "Huh, who's the producer?" He's Rick Rubin. I said, "I don't know, Rick." And he said, "He's the guy." It was like just the end of the year before when they did Run DMC Walk This Way, right?
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh, that's Rick Rubin. That was cool." Because hip hop was just starting. I didn't know anything about Russell Simmons. And then during the interim, probably before Christmas, was when the video "Fight for Your Right to Party" Beastie Boys came out. So I'd seen that. It was Christmas time. I'm putting the Christmas lights on the tree at my mom's house in the front yard. My buddy rides by on his motorcycle. This is the third time. "Hey, my boss's son's band is still looking for a guitar player and they won't give him a deal until they get in." I said, "All right, all right." So I met London. He came over and I was like, "Who is this creepy white faced guy with black hair and black boots and full length coats and everything?" And he seemed like a really down to earth, cool guy. And so I played him a bunch of Nugent stuff, and Iron Maiden. I was playing like you know and I like to play everything a little faster than it's on the record. And we were like jamming. He's playing air drums and everything. And he's like, "All right, I'll bring," so he brought over some cassettes and stuff. And so I learned a bunch of the Sam Hain
Wait,
songs.
wait, wait. I'm going to interject you, and I apologize for interjecting when I do. It's just because I want to be thorough and nerdy and stuff. So I
Am
apologize.
I boring you? Am
No,
I
no,
going
no,
on
no.
too far? I
No,
mean,
no, not at all.
Thorough.
I tend to go on tangents if you haven't seen that already.
No, that's all right.
My middle name is Tangent.
That's okay. That's okay, John. But here's why I wanted to interject. I'm very curious to hear. I've asked Steve Zing this question. I asked Damien who was the guitar player before you were, and Samhain this question. Who else did I asked Eerie Vaughn this question, and I want to ask you this question, especially with your sort of, you know, deep like education in music and understanding and the language that you have that I don't. How do you describe Samhain's music? What is Samhain doing? What makes Samhain's music unique in its own way? Just anything like that, as well as your impressions of what it was before everything got transformed with Rick Rubin.
Three elements. So they were cool riffs that were almost right.
Yeah.
They were cool. They weren't there, but they were very close. And the drums were like this funky, kind of cool, off the wall, spontaneous sound with these like hollow drum sounds that were kind of spooky. So the whole spooky punk metal thing, not speed metal, but punk metal thing was there. And then you had this booming baritone vocal howling over it. So production was horrible. The mixes were just abysmal. You couldn't even hear the guitar tracks, but the riffs were really cool and it had a thing. The vocals, they were very creative. The lyrics, some of them you could understand, some of them you couldn't, but it had like this horror movie, comic booky type of thing that was appealing. And, you know, there were stacks of guitars that were just chugging in the background, you know, like it was just like, like In My Grip and stuff like that. You know, it was like this crazy down picking. Never stopped, and I'm like, these guys are freaking maniacs. They're nuts. And I could hear the layers, and I guess maybe I intuited what I thought he was trying to get, but he just wasn't there. And I was like, I could hear that, you know, beefed up. You know, which turned into eventually I said, yeah, he's on to something. He's not there. So that was my take on it.
So in a way, from your POV coming into this band, you're like, okay, here's this band. It's really great, but it's not complete yet. And I am the element that is going to complete this and take this music into a whole ascend from where it's at right now into a whole other thing than what it is currently.
I wish I'd had that much confidence to say something like that at the time.
Well, I want to interject actually. So I always felt like, and of course I'm strictly speaking as an outsider with, you know, a small amount of music knowledge, etc. But you look at a song like Twisted Cane and you hear the demo, the pre-pro demo, whatever you want to call it. And then you hear the final version on the debut album and you've got that iconic riff. I always assumed that was you going, okay, you've got a song that's in, you know, what, A minor, it goes A to C, D sharp. Okay. And you're coming in with these sort of Tony Iommi-esque, flat fifth, you know, Devil's Triad riffs that are really iconic, and again, speaking sort of as a fan, as a also guitar player that you'd pick up on, I always wondered, or at least assumed, that maybe Glenn was coming to you with a song. I was like, okay, it's in, whatever key, it does this shift here, and I need a riff, go. That was your sort of strong point, I assumed. Could you sort of elaborate on
So,
that?
so I like that. I wish all of that were true. Some of it is true. So
Sure.
a lot of the like Twist of Cain, if still Glenn's favorite thing, right?
Yeah.
So Glenn loved the flat five,
Yeah. We all
right?
do.
He loved it. For me, back then, up until that point, like in jazz, flat five is called a tritone. So it was all about tritone substitutions, which was 2-5-1 key changes. So for me, it was just a functionality thing. For him, it was legitimate cadence. Like in jazz, you've got right. That's 3-6-2-5-1. Let's see, or just right. So that was the cadence, but flat five was a substitution if you're going to work off it. It wasn't a legitimate chord change. So, but it was cool because when you have right, when you have that, I'm like, I know that sound. So when he was putting it in his songs, I'm like, oh yeah, Tony Iommi, I got it, right? And he's like, yeah, and Glenn liked Black Sabbath, so that was like where we first connected, was on that. But the whole bending thing, that was so much of that on the first record was Rick Rubin. Because I wanted to stamp it heavy metal, with just pounded Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, just hit it hard and heavy and chug it. And Rick was like, it's got to flow, it's got to groove more, it's got to swing a little bit more. It's too heavy, it's too tight. So then, and Rick's right hand guy, do you know George Draculius?
That he played bass on You and Me, right?
He could have. He was in the studio. I don't know if he played bass or not, but he was there, right? George was always there. It wasn't just, hey Rick, it was, hey Rick, hey George. Yeah. Hey George, hey Rick. They were inseparable. I think they met at NYU, right? And so it was like Rick Rubin, Russell Simmons apparently were roommates at NYU, and our main handler, Renee Palome, was a friend of theirs, and I think she did some running for him, and she ended up being an integral part of the rock and roll company, Def Jam, right? That's where I met her, and she helped with all of our day-to-day stuff. So she set up the rehearsal. She helped when I needed a guitar. She got the money together and then got the approvals. And, if we needed a doctor, we called her, all that kind of stuff. She was like the communicator that got everything going. People forget all those people in between. We couldn't have done it without them, especially the accountants, all that kind of stuff. We would have starved. But when we got into the rehearsal studio, like Rick and George, they would come out to Jersey, or we did some rehearsing at Top Hat on 28th Street. I don't know if it's still there or not. I think it was owned by either Kramer or Hamilton, Aerosmith guys.
Yeah.
That's where we held the auditions. But so we did some rehearsing there. And when George and Rick were there, it was like Glenn had such a crooner type of vocal power that Rick didn't want him just to scream everything. He wanted him to sing. And that Lesson Zero experience was awesome because not only did Glenn get a chance to sing, he got a chance to write with Roy Orbison. And we were still Samhain at the time. We weren't Danzig yet. We got to go into the studio with all these guys and record basically a pop song, you know, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't Samhain, it wasn't Danzig, it was anything. So that was really my first studio experience working with Rubin and the group. I think I'd done some Samhain jam stuff with Glenn somewhere local, but this was the first official stuff. And it was great. And I think Glenn started hearing it because he was really into blues. He loved Willie Dixon, he loved Roy Orbison, he loved Elvis Presley, he loved those guys. And he's like, okay. So then he and Glenn started to hang out, going to wrestling matches and all that kind of stuff. WWF was big at the time. Ric Flair, woo! You know, they were always, they got the magazines, they knew all the stories, they could quote every Saturday Night Live skit that ever happened. And they started hanging out more. So that saved us a lot of time eventually when Rick would come in. And so, you know, things like that.
There was a rapport.
Yep. And then when it came to Twisted Cane, it started out, we recorded that in A, N, and G. That's in G. And I liked it because it was like... right? Nobody's ever heard that. We ended up doing it in A, and the whole band. It was like, you know, I wanted to do it faster, of course, and Rick was like, slow it down, slow it down, slow it down, slow it down. So when we came to tracking, that very first bend, I just didn't start the song. I just... as a joke almost. I didn't realize that was going to be the first note of the album.
Yeah.
You know, but that was the whole thing. So when I talked to Rick, he loved Jimmy Page, he loved Angus Young, he loved AC/DC, he loved the old school rock and roll. He liked some of the modern stuff too. Big Slayer fan, right? This was before he was trying, when I first auditioned, he was trying to sign Slayer over from, I don't know if it was Elektra, EMI, or whatever label they were on at the time. And Def Jam was still a thing. He and Russell hadn't discussed splitting up yet. So he was like, yeah, you know what? Maybe, he goes, I get you like the fast metal thing and all that, but this group, you know, trying to open it up, slow it down a little bit, open it up a little bit. And he goes, with all my rock groups, we're copying some AC/DC type patterns and some drum sounds. He would take the Back in Black CD and put it on the control board, you know, mixing board for the engineer, and say, give me that kick drum and that snare. That's where we're starting.
Mm-hmm.
Did the same thing for the Cult. If you listen to the first Danzig and the first Cult, if you A, B, and back, it's the same drum sound almost.
Yeah. Yeah.
You
what was the record? Electric he did?
Yep. Electric.
And it's definitely, you can hear the similarities. I mean, I've noticed
even
that
in the vocals, even in the lead
one.
vocals, the same reverbs.
Question to double back real quick onto You and Me. Was the do you remember this? And again, I'm asking you to remember things that are decades old and whatnot. So I don't blame you if you don't remember it. Do you have any memory of you and me starting out not so quiet, or like not with like the intro, but actually with Glenn very strongly saying "you and me," like some sort of like intro with the vocal before it goes into the song?
Oh, there's a lot of experimenting, and there are probably a couple
Sure.
of vocal tapes floating around. We tried a whole bunch of different things. Um, and like I said, we would move things from different keys. Well, to tie up an earlier thought that reinforces this as well, you said what was your role? What was your thing? Did you come in and you'd make it bluesier and you turn Glenn's rough riffs into the Danzig thing, right? Well, the first record, it was all of us. It was, it was Glenn, it was Rick, it was Eerie, it was George, it was Chuck, it was me, it was our friends and family and 2,500 other people, right?
Yeah.
That made that whole thing work. As things developed, um, I got to know Glenn and Rick and what they liked. So I customized stuff that I put out there, riffs, connections, endings, segues, all that kind of stuff that was more along the lines of what they wanted. And so I became a human loop machine, right? Before they even had them. So I would, right? That could have been that, or it could have been I would put key changes in. I like to do key changes for guitar lead sections and stuff. They hated all that shit, but I would make them listen to it anyway.
Sure.
So I would give them choices, and I would just keep going, and they would stop me when they got something either close, or I was just getting so far away. They were like, no. And what that would do is that would stimulate Glenn and go, wait a minute, I got an idea. Somebody give me a guitar or a bass. It's like, here, take this one. I'll play the bass. Eerie, get behind the drums or whatever. And, then we would sit there and we would bang through some parts and figure out the patterns. And then we would all switch back to what we were doing. And that's how most of the songs are written. Later on, when we got to LA, there'd be a lot of phone calls, and I got an acoustic guitar in my lap, and Glenn's got he's singing to me over the phone, and, like a romantic evening, a Tuesday night phone call from Glenn Danzig, and, angels here, wow, how your heart is cold, and, so I'm like, all right, wait a minute. I said, let me give you a note. Start on this note, and we put stuff together. So yeah, and the bluesier I got, and the less notey, because they didn't want the that Ingve stuff.
Yeah.
I love that Ingve stuff, man. I work hard to learn that crap. Every time he and Satriani and Eric Johnson came out with a new album, I was like, oh crap, new vocabulary. Here we go. Yeah. But those guys, they're like, no, we don't want that. Just make the guitar talk, So I would sneak in a couple of runs here and there, but they want the, then they're like, yeah, that's more like it. I like that, By the time we got to the second record, it all came together. I would have loved to have done a heavier version of that.
Yeah.
But they're like, nah, let's keep it, let's keep it Bayou Blues. And 777 was kind of like a compromise, all the bluesy kind of. Glenn likes the force. You know, he likes all that kind of stuff. And then we did the slide stuff together kind
So even in your chord choices in sort of the middle section there, I mean, like, it sounds to me like that was more your leaning, where he might have a key or sort of the skeletal pardon the pun, the skeletal frame of it, but you might come in with some of those little, like even the opening riff right there, the little, the embellishments, if you will.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, that's you. That's your
all
contribution.
All that's, he'll come in with this. And that's what he comes in with.
Yeah.
That's it.
That's what I pictured, because just talking from, this segueing from Misfits to Samhain and watching the guy's songwriting progress, which is phenomenal, but as a catalog of music from a specific musician, it makes such a massive jump when the band becomes Danzig, and presumably talking, as a guitar player myself and a fan and a musician, the sort of next noticeable person or ingredient is you. And not to take away from Chuck or Eerie or any other player, but again, when you think of like the iconic parts of those songs, whether it's Dirty Black Summer or Twist of Cain or whatever, you're thinking of, aside from maybe the vocals or the lyrics, etc., is the guitar riffs. And so I always just presumably assumed that was your contribution. It wasn't Glenn going, yeah, it does all this, because I knew, at least assuming so, that he couldn't play like those little embellishments. He comes in with the the sus to G or whatever. Cool. So you get a bluesy song in E, great. But that was your time to shine and go, well, what about this little riff? Or what, you're talking about being a riff machine, what about this? What about this chord arrangement under a verse or something like that? So it's cool to see that was coming from you organically.
And what was great for me, a huge part of the experience, like, I love working with Rick Rubin, because I never had to worry about the drum parts being good, because Rick, he can feel a groove, and when it's right, he knows it. And, rock and roll, that drum beat and sound has got to be its own song from the very first kick or snare to the very last. And when we sat there in the studio getting sounds, you could sit next to him and you'd rock. I tried it with him. I could never keep up. He would just go for hours doing it. But just trying to listen to what he was listening to and the feel. And so, I learned that it's like, okay, each part that goes down, that gets recorded, is in itself its own complete rock and roll song.
Sure. Were you guys doing drums and bass simultaneously to keep, or did you guys overdub all that stuff? Obviously guitars and vocals.
No. But... So we tracked when we were, initially the first week, traditionally for us, was drums. Right. So, whatever time it takes to get the sounds. And once you get the basic sounds, of course, with a guy like Chuck Biscuits, as he's playing, he's destroying the drums. No.
He sat on a bar stool, right?
Yep, he sat on a bar stool.
Amazing.
And one of the challenges with his
wait, hold on a second. Two things, because that was my next question was going to be, where does Chuck Biscuits get into all this? Explain why that's amazing that he sat on a bar stool. What's so special about that?
Just out of the box, just like normally a drummer would sit in a little drum throne, like, sitting down, and I wasn't there. John obviously was, but I mean, to picture someone sitting up, leaning into their drum kit.
So he's like more elevated than he should be while playing.
Yeah. So he's basically like, if you stood up, if you leaned up against the wall, okay, and you just squatted down a few inches to say where the height of a tall bar stool is.
Yeah.
So your bottom it's sitting on the edge of the bar stool, but you still have about 50% of your weight on your legs. Okay?
Okay, I totally understand now. Wow.
So, what does that allow you to do as far as kick drum goes?
That's a lot of weight.
More
That's
power.
So much more power.
Wow.
Exponentially more power. Not only for the kick drum, but because you're standing up. If you stand up and go hit a snare drum, you can wind up on that thing. The same thing with a floor tom, or you can wind up. You're standing up.
Yeah.
Right? You got your full arm swing, full tricep extension. And here's what a lot of people don't realize. Every snare drum hit that Chuck Biscuits ever made was a rim shot. He hits the rim of the drum and the head at the same time, which doubles the volume.
Oh.
But it chews up the sticks.
Yeah.
Like in 2 takes. So when you watch Chuck Biscuit playing in the studio, he's got a t-shirt wrapped around the headphones so they won't fall off. And you see sweat flying off. And then after a couple of takes, there's sawdust everywhere on the floor. He just wood chips. And he played DC-10 sticks, marching snare drum sticks. Right?
A monster.
So, it was a monster. So I've got that engine powering this thing, right? So that inspired me to, I'm not just going to go, She Rides. It's like, Now, a lot of those guitars I was recording with, I was using a Les Paul with Paul Reed Smith pickups in it, and I was actually using a Paul Reed Smith because the BC Rich was at the BC Rich factory because I broke the neck on the airplane ride out to open up for Slayer at the Palladium where they had the riot, yada, 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 yada. Right? So.
Yeah, just skip over that part.
Right. That's another story. So the point is in the recording studio, I wanted more gain. I wanted more distortion on the amps. I was overruled. I was overruled by Rick Rubin, not so much Glenn, but the engineers. So what ended up happening is I didn't get to, I had a high Laney 100 AOR Pro lead head. It was great for solos, but it was just too dirty and noisy for rhythms. It was just not, it was too noisy. So we had Marshall JMPs. We had a boutique amp called a Bedrock. We were using Marshall cabinets, all this. But all the chunk, to me, my mind, was coming out of the Neve EQs, the mic pre-EQs that were in the board. And here's my wife. You want to say hi?
I don't know.
This is Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
Nancy, introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Jeff. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Ace.
Jeff.
Welcome
Ace,
to the meeting.
Yeah, Ace. 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 He's the guy who bought some. Okay, Ace Von Johnson. Doesn't know Jeff. So today's my birthday. And
Happy
Is it
birthday.
really?
Yeah.
What?
Oh, I didn't know that. Happy
Dude.
birthday.
Oh,
thank
wait
you. We've got so interesting. You said Twisted Cane. You said Her Black Wings and all that. And you say stylistically. So Twisted Cane, if you watch where my hands are. Right? And then you have right? And then you have right? So those feels and this even where else do you think it came from?
From those two hands.
I'm just saying. All right, guys.
Listen, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. And
Yeah, you're
yes,
welcome,
there's
Jeff.
so much more we want to ask you, and we'll have to pick this up. We'll schedule something after you do your shows in March.
And and have you
Topic
guys, did you guys check out the Guitar World thing? You know, did you
I
read that
am
piece?
oh yes, I read. That's why I knew. That's why I asked
Okay.
you about your. I didn't know all that about your accident. That's why I was so. And then when you started warming, whatever you started, playing at the beginning, I'm going, Jesus fucking Christ! Like that. This guy, like literally retaught himself how to do all that. Like that was
Yeah.
just. That's why I started with it, frankly, because
And
I
look,
was just so blown away.
Is that the
Beautiful.
one? That's the
That's-
BC Rich Bich. Oh wow, look at
Yeah.
that.
Oh my God, it's beautiful. Look
That's
at that
amazing.
thing. Look
With
at
the
that thing.
Decals and everything.
I love
It's
it.
amazing.
Happy birthday.
Thank
Happy
you.
birthday,
So-
John. I had no
Have a
idea.
good party.
This guitar is about 90%. You may have heard about some of the Southern shows. We're going over it solder joint by solder joint, resistor by resistor, capacitor by capacitor. It doesn't have, all these switches aren't connected anymore. I call that the microwave. That's been gone for decades, but
Yeah.
had a rewrap pickup, just trying to get it. And now it's, it was years since I played it. So now I have to rememorize all of my spots.
Your sweet spots. What
All
kind
my
of pickups
sweet-
are in that?
So these are PRS standards. And this is the actual original deck that was rewound by the guy who wound them the first time in
Can
'87.
you lift it up a little bit higher? I can't see. Cool.
So
And-
this pickup failed over, this guitar turns 40 in April.
Wow.
I played this guitar at my high school graduation.
That's amazing.
I have pictures to prove it.
Amazing. One last thing real quick. Because I don't really know the ins and outs. What's the story? You got a rich bitch from Tracy Guns. Is that the story?
So Tracy had this horrible lime green metal flake 10-string bitch
Yeah.
that he wasn't playing, and Rick was friends with Tracy.
Yeah.
And we were on the road, and I was scouring the country trying to find these, which were very difficult in the late 80s to find them. And because they were only making one at a time, and not many people were playing it. Kerry King had a couple, right? Dave Mustaine wasn't playing them yet. And I was playing them, and I think Lita Ford, but she was playing the later ones.
Paris from the Cro-Mags had one too.
Okay. And so Rick and Tracy were talking, and Rick just bought it. And it showed up in my hotel room in Portland or something, lime green. And it was just like awful. So first thing I did, I didn't even string it. I just had it stripped and painted. And then I ordered the same pickups, and it was a hardtail. So I ordered the Kaler. I had a guy do a bunch of the work, custom work on it. And it's so funny because it was a 10-string, and the neck was so heavy that if you took your arms off of the guitar, it would just fall forward. But it had a warmth. It didn't have quite the bite that this had, but it had a warmth. So that was the one that I used on most of the rhythms on Lucifuge.
Wow.
Because it was, so I tried to play, whenever we did the Lucifuge stuff live, I would play that guitar for those songs.
And it ended up in a hard rock somewhere or something, you said?
Yep, it's done the rounds, yeah.
Okay. Okay, very cool.
But I lied to the hard rock and told him that one was this one.
Yeah, never get rid of the number one.
No,
number one
so-
stays by your side at all times.
So listen, guys, let me go. This was great. So
Thank you so much.
We will reconvene. Yeah, thank you, John.
An honor.
let me tell. Well, my pleasure. And Ace, let me just tell you. Let's see. I have a YouTube channel that's getting ready to launch. I'm going to have a group Facebook page that's getting ready to launch. I have a web designer. I've been up to New York with multiple big plastic totes of tour memorabilia that will make you drool.
Okay.
You know, the big Danzig skull, letter openers, everything. So we're getting a huge archive together of
Awesome.
things. Backstage passes from the Lucifuge tour and all
I've got
like
one of those.
Okay.
The upside down cross one.
Yep, yep. All that kind of stuff, you know. So we're starting to put it together. So I'll tell you one last thing as a teaser.
Mm.
All right. So I've found a couple of tracks that did not get used on Flesh Caffeine,
Cool.
and I want to do an orange vinyl re-release of Flesh Caffeine with those extra tracks along.
Beautiful.
And so you can chew on that until next time.
Okay. Happy birthday, John.
Happy
All right,
birthday,
thanks,
John.
guys.
I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right, Ace. See you
See ya.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, and right then and there, we had to snip it because, as it turned out, it was actually John Christ's birthday. Crazy, right? That John was such a sweetheart that he took time out of his birthday day to meet with us and go through some of his history. We will definitely be back with more John Christ. We're working out. We're going to work out that schedule right now and get it to you. So thanks for sticking in and watching with us. Again, make sure you follow everybody, all the links down in the description, Patreons and blah, 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 blah. And until next time, peace, hair grease, all the rest. Goodbye.